Okay. Can you hear me now, Jocelyn? Hello. I'm trying to. I can't tell whether or not my audio is good. Okay, awesome. Um, cool. Thanks. I'm just gonna push my mic off to the side. Cool. So I'm just gonna start my spiel over then. Basically, I guess the first 3 minutes of this video are going to just be silence. But thank you guys for coming in. Basically, I've been wanting to do more live streams, but like have been very like terrified to do one on my own because I'm always like, is there gonna be anyone? But also the other thing is that I really need to do like more wrap-ups. I always put off doing my monthly wrap-ups because I don't know why, just like sitting down and planning them and filming them and editing them. They just take so much more time than I always think they're going to. So I figured doing it in a live stream would be fun because a lot of these are books that I do want to talk about with people. Some of them I have talked about with people. Yeah, why not do it? So these are books that basically probably go back to like February. I've managed to review all the books I read in January and then covered a bunch of books when I talked about KJ Charles. But turns out there is still plenty of books that I need to talk about. So I was originally going to start in order. I was going to go with the first book that like I haven't gotten to, and that is a book that actually is like really popular that I didn't like. So I want to start with something a little bit more positive, and this is going to be In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. This is a memoir of an abusive relationship that she had with an unnamed woman, and basically it's a super interestingly structured book where each chapter or section or whatever basically treats this personal story and her examination of it through different like genres and literary techniques and references. So you know, there's like one like really striking section that's told like as if it's a choose your own adventure novel. Like that's the one that I remember the most. And then there's like a lot of like comedy, like it wraps up a lot of different tones and stuff, and that's something that could be really jarring, but it flows together super well. Jocelyn asked if I listened to audio. I didn't, but this is one that I definitely would be really interested. Did you? Because I'm curious what that experience was like. Did she narrate it? Did she have someone else do it? Like, did they kind of capture that difference in between the different sections within each one? Ooh, can I do the thing? Oh, yes, okay, I'm learning how to use StreamYard. That's the other point of this, is that I need to learn how to stream. And so that's what I'm doing now. And now I'm gonna hide it again. Oh yes, okay. That's really interesting. I'm really curious, I think I'm gonna add that to my audiobook queue. I've been trying to get more audiobook listening, and I've been listening to The Milkman right now. That's been like a months long endeavor. Not because it's bad, it's actually really, really good. It's just I haven't been sitting down with audiobooks recently. But I've been starting to like now like get back into the audiobook game, get back into the podcast game while I'm working. So I think I'm definitely gonna add In the Dream House to that. I think maybe a little bit later get some more new books read, but I bet it'd be really good. And the thing is, like, that decision to kind of like explore the story from all of these angles, I think it's a really interesting choice in the context of this book, because she's touching on an already complicated topic of abuse, which is further complicated by issues of like sexuality and race and all of this stuff that is sometimes really difficult to, I think, present in stories, especially when you kind of feel that burden of being like the singular story that a lot of people are going to know. And so I think choosing all of these different subjects, or sorry, all these different like genres and techniques to kind of like bring that story forth really spoke to like being able to present a lot of the different nuances that are hard to do with that kind of pressure of being the one person talking about the story. And it also lets the book become so many different things. Like it lets it be at times more academic, at times it even lets it be funny. There are like weird cosmic funny things, but also like just funny, like particular practical things. And at other times it lets it be like a very intense emotional journey. So I really thought that structure was really interesting. And I think it's just like made me think more about like how interesting nonfiction writing can be. Um, Army Soldier 33 mentioned listening to audiobooks when you cook and clean. That's something that I've been doing more of, or I've been trying to do more of, like when I do the weekend cleaning, like finally just like remembering my headphones, especially like when you're vacuuming. It's nice because like if you have your headphones on, you don't have to worry, like you can still hear them. And I feel like it makes the cleaning like a little bit easier. I don't know about easier. If I was more responsible and diligent about cleaning, each cleaning time wouldn't take so long. Um, okay, so that first book is like one that I loved. In the Dream House, I think is probably going to be one of my favorite reads for the year. I think it's going to be one of those memoirs that like is really like one that sticks with me. And I think especially again, like as an example of like really interesting nonfiction writing, I think it's just going to be one of those books that I like turn back to again and again. So that's like a book that was also super popular from last year and that like really lived up to the hype for me. The next book is one that was really popular last one and that I really didn't like, and this is Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is an oral history about this fictional band, Daisy Jones and the Six. It's partly a story about Daisy, who's like this quintessential like rocker it girl from like the 70s, 60s, that kind of era. And then it's also the story about Billy Dunn, who's the leader of the band The Six, and they have this like combined star-crossed path, I guess, that's like built on them like having explosive success as musicians, but also this like really explosive personal chemistry that like also overlaps with addiction and personal dilemmas and all of this stuff. And to be honest, I put off reading this book because I was in the minority that also didn't like Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, mostly because of the writing. Like just the way that she writes didn't really quite work for me. And then also because of the ending, I found the ending like pretty frustrating. And so I was like, this, I don't like to like seek out books that are popular just to like, dislike them. So I was like, I'm just gonna leave this be. I know a lot of people love this book. I don't think it'll be for me. But then I just like picked it up from the library and was like, well, why not? Like I feel kind of in the mood for this, at least this substance of this story that's going to be about like this particular pop culture era, and why not give it a chance? And I think part of the reason why I decided to give it a chance is because of its oral history structure, which actually did pay off. Like a lot of the things that I found frustrating about Reid's writing style in Evelyn Hugo was that like the way that she like adds sentences, just like there was a tendency to overdo it, and the oral history structure I think forced a little bit more editing in that regard because it's supposed to be written like people are talking, and so that I didn't have as much of a problem with, and I actually ended up finding most of this book really, really engrossing. Like I was actually super into it, read it very, very quickly, and then like I said, I didn't like it, and it's because of the ending. Like I think just there's this, both with Seven Husbands and with Daisy Jones and the Six, I think what I realized is that her books, like, I don't know if it seems like Reid really likes to tie things together very, very neatly in stories that don't necessarily like benefit from that. Like both Evelyn Hugo and Daisy Jones and the Six, what's really strong about them is like this messy, complicated pop culture history that they're evoking in them. And I really love that. Like that kind of stuff is like super my jam. And then the need to like have everything tied together so neatly, like kind of almost like it doesn't quite fit together with the story that's being told and kind of takes away from that messiness. And in this particular book, without kind of spoiling it, it really like took away from what I thought the book had been saying about the relationship between Daisy Jones and Billy Dunn. Like it kind of tried to make it a little bit cleaner than I actually thought the book was doing. And I thought the book was so much more interesting when it seemed to fully embrace how messy these characters are. And the way that it tried to like neatly tie their stories together, just like for me, like, I don't know, it just undid all of that. And so I think this for me, like Jocelyn's saying, like she doesn't have any more desire to read her books. I think this is the book for me that like, okay, I think I'm just going to accept that her books are not books that I'm necessarily going to enjoy. And so whatever book comes out next, I'm sure will be very successful. I'm sure it'll grab a lot of people's interest. I think I'm just going to probably probably not read it. Yeah, I think that's right. I think like this idea that she might be a good screenwriter, I think that could be true. Like, because that was what I liked about Daisy Jones, was that feel like I thought the oral history structure of it worked really well. And I'm curious too for the audiobook, how that played out, because I bet like that worked nicely as well. Especially if I'm guessing the audiobook, I would assume has good production. I don't know how book production gets decided, but I can't imagine that like with her success from Seven Husbands that they would just like drop the ball on it. But yeah, so I feel like there's a really interesting like story structure that would work, except for that ending. Like that would be the one thing for me that like I would hope that when they're adapting it, because I know they're doing the movie, like maybe hopefully someone will be like, what if we like mess up this ending a little bit more instead of kind of tying everything together neatly? Because that would be nice. Like maybe I don't like I know that I probably won't read any more of her books, or I don't know that. I might still get sucked in. But like I know that I'm less likely to read more of her books now. I'm curious enough about the movie to like maybe do that. We'll see. So yeah, so summary of my feelings on Daisy Jones and the Six is that it was a book that for me was doing really, really well. It almost like maybe changed my mind on Taylor Jenkins Reid, and then at the end, unfortunately, kind of lost me. Yes, I agree. The ending, yes, that is the summary of my feelings. The ending is not good. I try not to like, the book is the book, and I know people enjoy it, and like I can't say definitively like, is it a good ending? But I found it deeply aggravating against the substance of the book that came before. So the next book I'm going to be talking about is a romance novel, and this is The Lord I Left by Scarlett Peckham. This is the third book by her that I've read. This is about Lord Lieutenant Henry Evesham. This is a historical, sometime in British history, I forget which era, maybe Regency, I don't know, I'm kind of making that up. But sorry, Lord Lieutenant Henry Evesham is an evangelical reformer. He wants to ban the sex trade. Our other protagonist is Alice Hall, who is a sex worker to be, who ends up stuck with Henry on the road. They basically get kind of drawn into a road trip together because of family circumstances on both their ends, on both of their ends. Like, it's not super important to like the details of the plot. The plot is basically they go on the road together, kind of do a road trip through each other's like family angst, I guess. And then over the course of that road trip, like have a meeting of minds and other body parts. And like I said, this is the third Scarlett Peckham book that I've read, and I like her other books. This is a book that I've always found really interesting based on the premise and the plot summary. I thought that was like an interesting basis for a book. But similar to my feeling with Taylor Jenkins Reid, I'm also starting to realize that she might just not be, Scarlett Peckham might just not be a writer for me. And it's kind of hard for me to review in this context because I think a lot of times my feelings about a romance novel are less about whether or not that book is good and a lot more about just like what I specifically want that book to be. And that's not necessarily fair. Like, she set out to write one particular book, and just because it doesn't match up with what I want it to be does not necessarily make it a bad book. But in the context of like, I guess, reviewing on BookTube, what I'll say is like, for me, her premises seem like they're going to be very, very smutty. Like, they sound like they will lend themselves to a fun, like, hijinks ensue, smutty kind of plot. And they're just, like, not. And that's, like, a minor point, but it's just, I don't know. It feels like the plot summary is selling you on something that the book itself is not actually doing. But I don't know if I'm just projecting things onto the plot summary that weren't meant to be there. This book was like fine. The characters have their own journeys. They're like they have this like very clear tension that you'd expect from an evangelical reformer who's trying to ban the sex trade, and a woman who is actively deciding to pursue the trade. And there's a lot of historical stuff woven in about the sex trade in this context that's like well done. But like in terms of like that tension and the family drama that they're both dealing with and bonding over, it just got a little bit like meh for me, got a little bit one note. This wasn't like a book where I got to the end and I was like, yeah, I get it why these two characters love each other and like would do, their dramatic romance novel thing for each other. I just was like, okay, I guess this is what happens because this is a romance novel and that's what happens. So That is The Lord I Left by Scarlett Peckham. Summary of my thought is just it's okay, but I think she's just another writer who is not for me at the moment. The next book I want to talk about is Nothing to See Here by Kevin Wilson. This was a book that I heard about first from Marinez over at My Name is Marinez, and then I know other people have read it too and talked about it. So it was a book that wasn't necessarily super hyped up from last year, but it was a book that I feel in my tangential reading circle I saw a lot of people talking about, and I was really curious about it. The book is about this woman named Lillian who gets a call from her old boarding school roommate, Madison, who's basically asking for help with her stepkids who spontaneously combust, because that is, of course, the problem that naturally you would expect. Madison's husband and these kids' father, he's a politician, so there's a lot of concern, not necessarily about the spontaneous combustion, but about the optics of it all. And I lost track of what I was going to say. I was looking at the audio thing. Also, I was looking at Army Soldier 33 about reading historical and a romance. I think that's fair. Sorry, I'm deviating. I'm going back to The Lord I Left. There are some romance writers who do really, really good research into the history that works in really, really well. But I think it kind of takes some getting used to. But I've actually I feel learned a lot from reading romance novels because the writers that I've read have done some really great research. Anyways, sorry. Okay, back to the spontaneously combusting stepkids from Nothing to See Here. So Lillian and Madison, they have this strange relationship because they were boarding school roommates, but Lillian was she came from a poor family. She basically came in on a scholarship, and then she was expelled from the boarding school. And so a lot of the book is about piecing together the events that led up to that, how that's affected her relationship with Madison. And so there's just a lot of that background to their relationship that mix in with Lillian's current state, where she's trying to just figure out her life, which was very much affected by these events in her high school, and also how a lot of issues of class and privilege have basically intersected with these different parts of their life, including combusting children. And through taking care of these kids, Lillian finds a lot of herself, and it's a really interesting story because of the way that it intersects with the weird relationship she's had with Madison, but also her relationship with her mother, and just what the state of her own ambition is now. This book brought up two very specific sets of feelings for me. One are boarding school feelings, because my high school was a boarding school. I was not a boarder. I feel I always issue that disclaimer, even though it probably doesn't mean much to a lot of people, but I was a day student. But yeah, so there's this subset of the feeling of this book that's very much about the weirdness of boarding school culture, how insular it is, the privilege associated with it, how class kind of works in even when people try to pretend that it doesn't, which is a part of the story. And the other subset of my feelings for this book were I worked at a daycare feelings, which I only worked at a daycare for a month, so I am not an accomplished I'm not an accomplished experienced daycare person, but even within that month, there's just a lot of stuff that I learned about I don't know, the complications of taking care of children, and in particular the stepkids in this book reminded me a lot of this one kid that was in that I was in the room that I was monitoring, and who was super sweet, but was also dealing with some family stuff, and the way that they were processing the things that were happening to them reminded me so much of his behavior too at that time. And obviously this is not my story to tell, but it just a lot of the feelings that Lillian was having and trying to figure that out reminded me of trying to process how to take care of someone who I know is really, really sweet and is also just at an age where he's trying to process a lot of things that are very difficult, and that are are difficult. And so this book is like a very short, fast moving book, but it also packs like this huge emotional punch. Like you're just like, crap, like I feel like 50 pages of feelings just like got walloped at me, because it's just so packed in with like these kids who are trying to figure out their own stuff, and Lillian who's figuring out her stuff. And like there's like this whole sense of a found family and all of that, and tied in with this weird element of spontaneous combustion. Like it's such a weird element because it's kind of like everything else in this book is so grounded in reality, but like also a little bit elevated. Like it is satirical about this whole politics and optics of it all. But yeah, then you throw in spontaneous combustion, but like it kind of makes sense. Like it works. It's weird, but it works. So I definitely recommend this book if you're looking for something a little bit yeah, like I feel like right now, like with quarantine and pandemic stuff, like I weirdly have been drawn to books that are a little bit tougher, and this is one that I think would have been like good in the past month, even though I actually read it a few months ago. So that was Nothing to See Here by Kevin Wilson, which again I highly recommend. The next book, speaking of tough books, is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, which is a historical fantasy novel based on China in the 20th century and a lot of the history of warfare and stuff in the past century. And the book is focused around Rin, who has grown up in a village and basically found her way out into a spot at the top military academy called Sinigard. The first half of the book is about her time at the academy and her starting to kind of like uncover these latent magical abilities that basically like people are like, magic's not real, and she's kind of like, oh, well, seems like it's kind of real. The second half of the Poppy War is focused on war, and I am very torn about this book, which I've like talked about in various places on Twitter and stuff, but this is the first time like I'm actually talking about it on YouTube. Yogi with the book, Jocelyn, she like helped me process some of my feelings about this. So where I'll start is just that I am very, very torn on this book still, and I don't think I'm going to fully know what my feelings are until I follow it up with the second book. So basically, I thought the world of this book was clearly very well built out. I believe Kuang is like working in, I think she's studying history. She clearly has like a deep knowledge of the elements that she's drawing from. And so a lot of that I was really, really into. Where I think this book was really difficult for me were the characters themselves, where they felt for me like I couldn't figure out my connection to them, and I couldn't like get invested in them to get attached to the plot. When I was like writing notes as I was reading it, the way that I phrased it was like I couldn't find the through line. Like I knew that like Rin is driven by the desire to survive. She's this character who wants to escape her village, to go to this academy, and then when she's at the academy, she wants to like make sure that she's at the top. And then this eventually becomes like a quest for power. But it's the way that that journey like takes place. Like I see the overall trajectory of it, but I don't completely. For me, it never quite connected to her as a character. Like I was never quite clear on why the choices she made seemed like the best choices for her at the time, especially because she seems like a very smart, clever character. And so the way it just didn't connect for me. And my problem is not like an issue of not liking Rin. I just didn't feel like I got her, which might be my fault. It's just like I don't completely understand the connections between the motivations and the choices that she made, even if on paper they make sense, which like it's a book, it's on paper. I don't know why I'm having a hard time with this, but like it just didn't quite gel for me. A thing that people have talked about is that some people's frustration with the book is that the first half and the second half are two completely different books in some ways. Like they feel like there's like a very abrupt shift halfway through the book when you go from like the academy to the war. And I didn't mind that as much. To me, in some ways, that felt like sort of like the point of the book, that learning about war in a classroom is super different from actually living through a war, and actually having to make the decisions. Like we spend the first book we spend the first half basically talking about war as theory. Like we're talking about all these strategies and choices that in the second half of the book you actually have to put into practice, and you're starting to realize the horror of that. And I thought that that's like an interesting juxtaposition, but like I do think that the book didn't necessarily make that connection very well. So I get why that's like a harder transition for other people. what was harder for me was like just how brutal like the last maybe 25% of it was, like, which is where you start to get like really direct comparisons to World War II. Definitely the hardest one is there is a scene that Kwong also talks about, after, like in the afterword or author's note, that is like directly like lifted from descriptions of the rape of Nanking. And like that is a very brutal event in history, obviously, and so there's no way to like make that easier to read. So I get that, but one of the things that was a little bit tough about that scene is the way that it kind of connected to one of the female characters who we find like we meet in the first half of the book, who basically seems to come back only to be brutalized in the second half. And I don't know if that's something that like maybe she gets more time in the second book, maybe she gets more characterization, she gets treated a little bit more like a character and not like sort of she's there to go through this, and to like be a character that Rin sees and deals with. But like the way that it happened in this book alone was weird to me. And then also like that, like while that is definitely the most brutal scene, the book overall like builds to basically the most destructive decision of Rin's life that she makes, and then just kind of abruptly ends. And the real world parallel to that, like from like actual history, is like very striking and horrific. And for me, that was a tough place for the book to end. And I don't like, especially because of how abruptly it ended. I think it like it only works because I know there's going to be a second book, but I'm also frustrated by that because there's really there's minimal dealing with the fallout of that. But like I know, like again from talking with Jocelyn, like thank you very much for helping me sort out my feelings on Twitter, because I finished it and was just like sitting there like at my desk, and I was just like in a daze. Like I was just like, what did I just read? So it was very helpful to be able to like process that feeling like right away, because otherwise I think I would have been angrier about it. And I think like I'm a little bit more excited now to read the second book. I'm still kind of taking a little bit of a break before I start it, but I'm hoping to kind of see more like development of Rin, and hopefully that will like build out a little bit more of the issues, because I can also see some of my frustrations with this book being more about this being like a first book, and that maybe like with a little bit more like of the world developed, maybe more of the story like established, maybe we'll see more from that, more from Rin and more for the rest of the characters. That is very much what I hope for. So that is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, which is a book that, to summarize, like I have mixed feelings on, but I am also like willing to give another chance, and like get to know a little bit better with the second book. Moving on from that is She Said by Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey. This is a nonfiction book. It's by the reporters who led the New York Times investigations into Harvey Weinstein. And so I think Catch and Kill by Ronan Farrow probably had a little bit more buzz around it. I think it gained a little bit more of a like foothold, I guess, in people's experience of reading about Harvey Weinstein more recently, which in part is because Catch and Kill is more thrillery. And I read Catch and Kill last year. I think I talked about it during Nonfiction November, and I thought it was a very well-written book, but I also found it a little bit jumpy in terms of time and story, and in a way where I wish there had been like just a few like little details done a little bit differently that would have made it a little bit easier to piece together the overall story. So compared to that, I thought She Said was a little bit more direct and linear, which I liked, especially as like a recounting of the specific investigation. It is a little bit awkward to read at times because it's written by two people who work together. So like they are both co-authoring this book, but there are moments where like in the book, Jodi is having a conversation with Megan, so they can't like easily slot in like an I or we to talk about things. So they note this early on, they made the decision to just refer to like both of themselves in the third person throughout the book, which is like a little bit weird, but like I think like I'm glad they addressed it, because I think it was probably like the easiest way to deal with this. like I said, I think it's a little bit more clearly written than Catch and Kill, in part because it's a little bit more specifically focused on the women's voices that built the case against Harvey Weinstein. So I think the task is a little bit more straightforward, whereas I think Catch and Kill's point is more about the structural issues that keep these stories from coming forward. So like issues not just like at the company that Harvey Weinstein at, but like issues in terms of like where Ronan Farrow was working at, like NBC trying to cover this stuff up. So I think that task is a little bit more convoluted to work through, whereas this one has a more specific kind of goal. Where it did lose me a little bit was like at the last chapter, where it tries to branch out from talking about Harvey Weinstein to talking about Christine Blasey Ford and her accusations against Justice Kavanaugh, which I think what they were trying to do, especially in this book, they didn't really want it to just end up being a Harvey Weinstein book, even though that's obviously the point of it. But they wanted to be able to make it more broadly about like the action of women speaking out in general. So they were also addressing stories of sexual harassment in other workplaces. And then with Christine Blasey Ford, I think they also wanted to illustrate the complexities of speaking out and like making it clear that things don't always go well, because like the Harvey Weinstein case, like it's not like necessarily like a success story. Like I don't want to like call like the case of Harvey Weinstein like a success, but in the scheme of women being able to speak out and be believed, it was eventually relatively a success in the sense that people listen to their stories, and Harvey Weinstein was convicted, which is like not a thing that has happened to a bunch of other men, especially powerful men in his position. But I think including Ford's story was a way of showing that, like, you know, this woman made this really incredibly difficult choice to speak out, and it did not work out the way that she would have wanted it to. And so this is why it's so complicated for women to speak out. So it was weird because it was a little bit of a left turn in the book, but I understand why they put it in there as well. So I'll say that I think She Said and Catch and Kill are both good books to read. It's a little bit funny. Like I was like outlining my thoughts this morning for this, and then like there's this whole thing going on right now where one of the New York Times writers just wrote this whole piece about Ronan Farrow and like whether or not like he's too good to be true, and like questioning his reporting methods. I haven't read the article. I've just like seen media Twitter talking about it, and most people seem to be pretty critical of the New York Times article. But it seems weird to be kind of talking about both this New York Times investigation book and the Ronan Farrow investigation book. I'm always glad for more people in media like investigating these stories. I think you never want just one reporter going after it. I think this is an example where having both the New Yorker and the New York Times go after Harvey Weinstein was actually really impactful. There's probably a lot of other behind the scenes stuff going on that made Harvey Weinstein also vulnerable, but I think the combined strength of both like the New York Times and the New Yorker like working on this was what helped get it this huge profile in people's, I don't know, collective understanding of what was going on. So I don't really care like what this other like conflict is. Like it seems like in this case the reporters here and She Said did a really good job. Ronan Farrow and Catch and Kill did a really good job. I also really recommend the Catch and Kill podcast, which covers a lot of similar parts of Ronan Farrow's story, but also includes other interviews and also expands on other parts that are in both this book and his book that I think are worth listening to. So if you're looking for like a podcast right now, I think like even if you've read both of these books, the Catch and Kill podcast is also worth listening to. So yeah, that's She Said by Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey. The next book that I want to talk about, going like back into fantasy world, is Spin the Dawn by Elizabeth Lim. This is a YA fantasy, and the summary describes it as Project Runway meets Mulan, which is like very appropriate. It's based on this girl named Maya Tamarin who wants to support her family. She wants to be a great tailor, and she ends up drawn into a courtly competition to basically become the next royal tailor. Except that, of course, she has to pretend to be a boy to do it. And she also has like a pair of magic scissors who scissors aren't a person. Well, maybe they are. I don't know. They're a magical item, and they seem to have taken a liking to her. They want to help her. There's also a court magician named Idan who is helping her, even though she doesn't trust him. So there's like this combination of like pretty outfits that are getting made, a competition, magic, courtly intrigue, all of this stuff. And they got put together in this book, and it was a lot of fun to read. I read this like pretty much right after the Poppy War, and it ended up being like kind of like a nice like antidote to some of just like my general like, oh, like what just happened kind of feeling. Which I liked. I think it was a little bit nice to read a fantasy novel that was like, as much as like I love like war stories and like fight scenes and stuff, it was also kind of nice to read a story that was like the protagonist just like wants to make things, and she wants to just keep making things, and she wants to make them really well, and sometimes the things that she makes also makes her super powerful, like all of this stuff. So that was like really fun. Some of the reviews that I saw for this book kind of mentioned like the Project Runway of it all is really just like a small part of the story. It like kind of is like the first half of it. The other big bulk of the story is a quest that Maya ends up going on with Edan. And I've seen some people say like that they wish that that Project Runway part was a little bit longer. But I kind of like the quest part more. I thought like maybe it's just because like the contest was a little bit rushed. So like maybe it would have been a little bit more compelling if like the contest had really been the focus of it. And it was kind of weird because there were all these things that made it sound like the contest was supposed to stretch on like as long as possible. Like there's this whole thing about like this, like the emperor of this region is like marrying like the enemy's daughter, and she's trying to like not make it happen. So she wants to make this contest go on as long as possible. But like, because there are Project Runway twists where like, you know, multiple people get eliminated at a time, like something like that. I was kind of like, this seems like a little bit inconsistent. So I was like, this is weird. But other than that, like once you kind of like suspend that disbelief and just accept it for what it is, which is just like super fun and like a delightful story of intrigue and beautiful clothing, like I love this book. And like the next book is coming out in July, and I think like there's probably like, I think the easy criticism to lob at that is that like there's a lot of elements that are typical of YA fantasy, like, you know, like mysterious dude who like helps out, and like there's the obvious romance and like that kind of stuff. But I feel like those kind of expected things are great if they're done well, and for me this was a book that was done well. I love this comment that it sounds like it was nice seeing you too, Jocelyn. I love this comment that it would be like especially great as an animated movie, because I especially for something visual like this, like with clothes and stuff, I would have loved to see this as like a comic book too, just because like being like the way that she described the clothes was like really great, very like you're just like, oh shit, that sounds gorgeous. But it would have been really nice to see it. So that's like, if I was gonna like nitpick the book, like that's the thing that I would nitpick, except it's not really the book's fault, that's just what it is. But I would love to see a comic book version or an animated movie, like that would be super cool. So that was Spin the Dawn by Elizabeth Lim. Highly recommended if you're looking for like a fun YA fantasy that just like incorporates magic and courtly intrigue kind of stuff. The next book that I'm going to talk about is, and this is going to be the second to last book, this is Carry On by Rainbow Rowell. And to be honest, this is the first Rainbow Rowell book I've read, and this is probably like a weird one because this is like actually a book that she wrote based on a fictional Harry Potter-esque fandom from another one of her books, which I believe was Fangirl. And maybe it showed up in another book, I don't know. So like I said, like I haven't read her other books, and I feel like that probably impacts like my reading of this book, but I'm not sure. So I'm really curious if other people have read it. If you have feelings about, if you disagree with some of the takes that I'm about to go through, I would love to hear it. So like I said, this is a fictional Harry Potter-esque fandom that is now being turned into its own book that is about like Simon Snow, who is our fake Harry Potter, but who's also not particularly good at saving things. He's not very good at like being the chosen one, kind of like Harry Potter, but like he had like a crew and stuff. And then, well, Simon Snow has a crew too, but whatever. Anyways, so Simon Snow, fake Harry Potter. Then there's Baz, who's like basically the fake Draco of the book, but they're roommates, but also Baz might be a vampire, and so they like don't always get along. Even though they're roommates, they're roommates at the Watford School of Magics. And so there's also an evil to be defeated, and eventually the two have to like team up to defeat it, maybe, kind of. They get like drawn into a plot together, basically. And so like I said, I'm like very curious how this book plays out to someone who is like a read fangirl and then B B hasn't read Fangirl or Harry Potter, because I felt like for me, having read Harry Potter but not having read Fangirl, like it was like, I mean, it's impossible to read this book without reading it as a response to Harry Potter. And like that's not just like the obvious parallels built between like characters, like there's even like a pseudo Hermione and whatnot. But just like even thematically, this book seemed like it wanted to raise a lot of questions about privilege in a world of magic that like seem or like they originated in questions that you would have if you read Harry Potter, like in terms of like who's powerful, who gets to have magic. And so, and also like how do you change the system that's so ingrained in these families that have this magical ability? And so I'm curious what it would have been like to read this book without having those questions like in mind. And so for me, this felt like ultimately like a very thin book. Like the story felt kind of thin, the characterization felt kind of thin, arcs also felt thin. Like any substance that there was in the book felt like substance that was brought in from the other series that inform it. And I don't think that that's necessarily like a bad thing. I actually think it's kind of neat that this book exists, like because like obviously like there's a whole question about like who gets to publish their version of fan fiction, but this isn't just like fan fiction of Harry Potter. This is like an imagined world that is in itself kind of like a commentary on Harry Potter. And I think that's really interesting, but I also just don't know that the conversation that this book seems to be having with Harry Potter actually like went anywhere. There were some like vague questions about like whether we should be like sustaining a system of magic built on privilege and like what it takes to eliminate a system that's built on consolidating power in an elite group. But like I didn't feel like it actually answered those questions. I didn't feel like it kind of went anywhere with them. And then the way that like the big bad or whatever wraps up was very unsatisfying. Like the true villain of the piece, like the way that that book built to like what is actually the like underlying evil of this world was like very uncomfortable. So overall, I just found the book very unsatisfying. And I know that there's like more books in the series, but there's like nothing wrapped up, or at least there's one other book. I don't know if there's going to be like a trilogy or anything, but there's nothing that was wrapped up in this book that made me feel intrigued to find out like more about the directions that the series would take. So I was debating, like I borrowed it on from my library, and I got the next book in and was like, should I read it? And I was just like, I don't know, I'm not interested. Like I could, but I'm not feeling it. So I don't think I'm going to be returning to it unless I find out something that like makes like kind of piques my interest, because I just don't think that this book brought anything very interesting to me in terms of what it was doing with the characters or its connection to the Harry Potter-esque inspiration it was built on. So that was Carry On by Rainbow Rowell, a book that for me was like fun when I read it, but like overall not my favorite read, or not really particularly satisfying. The last book that I'm going to be talking about is My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Otessa Moshfegh. This book is about an unnamed narrator who is like basically the pinnacle of like hip New York cool girl in the year 2000, but who is also like, she's just in a bad state of mind, and all she wants to do is just like sleep for a year. Like she has basically this plot to get a terrible psychiatrist to prescribed to her a lot of pills that will let her essentially hibernate. And this is a book that I had like very little expectation of liking. I know a lot of people really enjoyed it last year. Like I think this was a lot of people's favorite books in the last year or two. I forget when it was published. It was very recent. But I was also curious about it because I don't know, it seemed interesting the way that people were talking about it, but like I said, I did not particularly have any high expectations to enjoy it. The protagonist, like, it's especially because like the protagonist is like that peak version of kind of like the literary version of a New Yorker who is just like so cynical and so disenchanted and disconnected in a way that is like so acutely a function of her privilege. Like it's not that she doesn't have things to like feel like shit over, but also like that it's also frustrating to read some of the ways that she is disenchanted and like almost borderline self-indulgent. Except that I also don't think the book really treats her like as anything but self-indulgent, which kind of helps. Like in a weird way, the book acknowledging that the character is the way that she is makes it easier to read about her. Like she has had shit to her, but also she is mean and she does not want to explore any other way of dealing with her life except getting the shadiest doctor she can to provide this to prescribe this like super intense combination of drugs that'll basically let her hibernate. And she has like this best friend named Riva, who she's like super awful to. She's got this on again, off again, like older Wall Street boyfriend who is awful to her. And it should be like kind of unpleasant to read, except that like this is a book that I did not find unpleasant at all to read. I don't know, part of it might have been like reading this, like I read this super recently, and it's a book that I saw people starting to recommend at the start of lockdowns, like at the start of all of the quarantines, and it kind of made sense because it's about this character who just like wants to shut off the entire world. And there was something very striking about reading that particularly right now. But also the other big element is that this is a book that starts in New York City in the year 2000. And so there is this looming specter of 9/11 throughout the book. Like this is very much in a before 9/11 state until it's not. And it's a weird thing to like know that you're expecting in this book, because it's like this huge major like event, right? It's this huge thing that you know that's going to happen, but it also gives some clarity to some of the stuff that's going on, because you know that like the existential crisis that the narrator is dealing with is also like about to face what is like basically an even more existential crisis or crisis in general, that until 20 years later would basically be the, like one of the biggest crises in the United States. So it's a very weird thing to know that that's coming, and I was like half dreading it but also half sort of like anticipating it, and I found it really interesting. I don't think it's a book that's like necessarily meant to like make you sympathetic to the character, but she somehow works in a way that that I found really compelling and that I wanted to read more of. Ooh, this is interesting. This is going back to carry on and Alistair's comment about boarding schools magic. And that's really interesting. I haven't thought about that in the context. Obviously, like, my experience of boarding school is built out of the U.S. school system, which also has like its own issues of class as well. And I don't know how it compares to the UK. But I haven't like thought about that in the context of like how we talk about like Harry Potter boarding schools, because I know a lot of people have found boarding school, like there's kind of like a romanticized notion of boarding schools in part because of Harry Potter, and that must be really weird to read, like kind of knowing against like some of the other contexts, or sorry, the other connotations of boarding schools in regards to class. Yeah, thanks for that. That's an interesting thing I hadn't thought about. Okay, so sorry, going back to my year of rest and relaxation. Okay, so yeah, I remember like when I finished reading this book, I had this feeling that like this was similar to the Poppy War, where I ended it and was just kind of like, oh, like, because it ends where you think it's gonna end, and you're just like, what? Wow. And I had this feeling like of both, like I want to talk about this book with like everyone, and I also don't want to talk about it with anyone because it feels like such a personal read. Like it's a weird read. It's at times a tough read, but I'm glad that I read it, and I'm glad that I read it at this point because I think it just hit me in the place that I needed it to hit me, which I guess is a mildly self-indulgent but also self-critical place. And so I'm glad I read it, and now I get why everyone was talking about this book before, because it's very interesting. So those are all the books that I had to talk about, and I don't know what delay I'm on between me and you guys, but if you guys have any questions or want to talk about anything with any of these books, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Otherwise, I'm just gonna kind of babble a little bit more about just like what I'm reading, I guess, right now, and what kind of books I'll probably be talking about in the next few months. Right now, the book that I am currently most focused on is Dreamland, The True Tale of America's Opiate Epidemic. I'm reading this with Nicole Sweeney for our nonfiction book club. So this is by Sam Quinones. It's about the history, as you can tell, of the opiate epidemic. It's told specifically, or most specifically, through the story of this one town. I think it was Plymouth, Ohio, I want to say. And that was basically kind of ravaged by the opiate epidemic, but also like the story of the advertising for, oh, cool. Yeah, getting, so getting both into the story of like how the medical advertising went into, how medical advertising kind of like changed and played a role in the influx of the opiate epidemic, as well as factors in this one Mexican town that really drove a lot of the trade into the US. And then also the story of the people in this one town and how like all of these factors kind of work together. So we're going to be, so again, that's Nicole Sweeney. We're going to be doing the discussion over on her channel next month, which I'm really, really excited about. And then after that, that's going to be June 13th at 5 p.m. Eastern on Saturday. So you can join us for that. And then after that, we're going to be picking out a science book for July. And probably we're going to try to pick something a little bit happier to read, because the books we've been reading have been a little bit on the not necessarily always sad side, but like definitely a little bit more serious side. So definitely looking forward to picking out something that'll be a little bit more cheerful for July. But this book has been really good so far. I started reading it last weekend, and I've been like, it's very like fast moving, and very like, I like the way that it's laid out right now. It's too early for me to like give a lot of thoughts, but I've been enjoying it so far. Some other books that I'm reading right now, I'm currently listening to the Milkman audiobook, which I mentioned, and I'm trying to get through that a little bit more quickly because I want to move on to a bunch of other audiobooks. I've got the Jessica Simpson memoir, which I'm very excited about. I've heard a lot of good things about it. I think I've got also a few other books on the audiobook that I want to get to. And then what do I have on my Kindle right now? I'm currently, let's see, I like placed like so many like holds on Overdrive like a few weeks ago, and they've been slowly coming in. And I really, really love that you can now on Overdrive do the thing where like you push back like when you're gonna actually get it. Like if you get the book, you can be like, actually, like I would like this 3 weeks from now, because otherwise it was getting too stressful. It was like I don't have time to read all these books in 2 weeks. So right now I have Frederica, which is another Regency romance by Georgia Heyer. Which I'm currently reading, but I'm kind of like, I think it's a good book, but just like I'm not super in the mood for it. Then Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir, I think. This was like a super hype book from last year, I believe, like fantasy sci-fi, I think is the way I've heard it described, about like necromancy. I really have no idea what to expect from this book. It's like in that category of hype where like I can't really parse out like whether or not it's good, because either your opinion is like, I love this book, or like the opinions are like, I don't get why people love this book, like that kind of thing. So I'm curious to find out for myself if I like it. I currently have Wicked Saints on my Kindle, but I think that's going to be due tomorrow in the library, and I'm not sure I'm going to finish it by then. A few other books that I want to read. I bought ebooks for The Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. Sorry, not The Wolf Hall. Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, which is a huge historical fiction book, I think, about Cromwell that people really like, so I'm curious about it. Another is The Empress of Salt and Fortune, which I believe is a fantasy novel about an empire of sorts. And then I also have The Queen's Shadow, which is a book about Padme from Star Wars, which I'm excited about. I haven't really read many of the Star Wars books, but Padme is a character who I felt was done very poorly by the movies. I started watching Clone Wars, so like I'm curious about her in that story. But I've heard good things about this book. E.K. Johnston wrote it, and I've read one of her other books, and I really enjoyed it. And this was like free. It might still be free. I'm not sure. You can look it up, The Queen's Shadow. So I'm very curious about that. So that's in my June reading probably. I'm really bad at actually assigning what books I'm going to read when. I'm really bad at TBRs, which is why I never do them. But these are the books that are currently on my Kindle and that hopefully I will get to. Okay, I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed Gideon, because I think this is like a very measured view of it being overhyped, but that you enjoyed it. Sorry, I don't know if this. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. So I'm gonna keep that in mind, and I'll probably get to it soon. But those are the books that I have for now, and then I've got like some other things that I want to read. For work, I'm kind of looking into Microcosmos by Lynn Margulis and Dorian Sagan. I write for a show called Journey to the Microcosmos, and this is like related to some stuff that I've been wanting to learn about, and also about Lynn Margulis in general, because she is a local hero of sorts. Well, she passed away a few years ago, but she's a pretty well-known she was a well-known microbiologist who's responsible for the endosymbiotic theory, where basically like one organism consumed another organism, and that's how we got like eukaryotes that could do photosynthesis. It's a whole thing. So I'm excited to read this. She wrote this with her son, Dorian Sagan. So I'm curious about this book, and I'm interested to dive into it. Another book that I've been reading right now is Check Please, Part 2. I read Part 1. This is just like a really cute hockey romance, college hockey romance. I read Part 1 last year, and I thought it was really sweet. And I started Part 2 pretty recently. And this is like a great series for like in terms of just like a really nice, sorry, I completely lost track of my thought. This is a really cute series. Like if you just want something like cute, it's a cute series for want something. Sorry, I'm not being very eloquent right now. But it's sweet. The main character, Biddy, is like this super wholesome guy who just likes to make pies. Words losing me a little bit. And this is like my own particular thing. I don't like sweetheart and honey as endearments between people for some reason. Or especially like in young couples, it feels really old, and it's like a common thing in here, and for some reason that's really throwing me off. Okay, I'm really curious about this Caribathon. If you have suggestions for authors that you're looking into for June, I'd love to hear them. And if you have like any videos or anything, or your any sources or anything, I would totally want to find some more Caribbean authors to read. Yeah, what other books? I don't know. I have a stack of books next to me that are like all the books that I haven't read yet. There's the Book of Lost Saints by Danielle Jose Older that I want to get to. I Contain Multitudes by Ed Young. The two books that I checked out from the library before quarantine happened and that I haven't actually read because I wasn't in the mood for them. And I was like, fuck, why didn't I just check out like 10 more books? If I had known this was going to happen, I could have gotten all these books that like I could have had all this time with, but I don't know. That's like a very minor loss in the grand scheme of things. Luckily, Overdrive has been there for me. So that has been good. Oh, okay. I feel like I've been talking for a while. Thank you guys for joining me for my first live stream. This was a lot of fun to do, and hopefully I will do more. Well, not hopefully, it's up to me if I'm going to do more of them. But yeah, thank you guys for joining me. Maybe I'll do my monthly wrap-ups more in live stream form because it's a lot more fun to talk about them. I feel like I said, like I don't like filming wrap-ups, but I feel like it's more fun going through all of these like as a conversation than like just talking about a bunch of books at once into a camera that like otherwise I like feel bad for like putting off to a wrap-up. Yeah, so I'm going to wrap this up now. Thank you guys so much for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope some of these books maybe sound good to you guys, and I'll see you next time I do a live stream or next time you guys do videos or I do videos, all that stuff. Bye. Oh, hold on. Crap, sorry. Okay. I was gonna say bye, but then figuring my way again around StreamYard and everything, and figuring out the delay between when I say things, things show up in the chat. But I just wanted to highlight this before I head out. The polished hoe. Move this up. This does sound like a very intense book. When an elderly Brimshire village woman calls the police to commence to a murder, the result is a shattering all-night vigil that brings together elements of the African diaspora in one epic sweep. That sounds very intense. Okay. Thank you all for tuning. Okay. Thank you guys again. I'm going to head out now, and bye.